Hey everyone, Wiley Beckert here. In this video I'm going to be giving you a rundown of my ink painting process. If you want more detail on the tools and techniques I'm using here, I publish step-by-step process tutorials for my supporters on Patreon at patreon.com/WileyBeckert. What you're looking at here is the preliminary drawing for the Queen of Humility. I start all of my paintings with a fairly tight drawing like this, and since I like to draw and paint on different kinds of paper, I'm going to be working over a print of the drawing on watercolor paper. I'm making two major adjustments to the drawing to prepare it for print. The first is that I'm going just a little bit larger. In this case, my drawing is around 9 by 12 for an 11 by 17 painting. And secondly, the print is at a fairly low opacity because it's really just going to be a guide for my pencil under drawing, and I don't want it showing through at all in the final painting. As I'm working here, you can see the contrast between that initial low opacity print and the pencil drawing itself. I'm working in 9H pencil here because I find that the harder lead is a little less prone to smudging on the watercolor paper. And I'm really just focusing on tracing the line art at this point. I'm not doing any sort of shading. It'll be faster and easier to build up the values in ink, so I'm not even worrying about that at the pencil stage. It probably seems a little bit redundant to be doing the same drawing twice like this, but my sketching usually involves a lot of erasing and reworking, and I like to keep the lines of the final painting really clean. So for me, it's definitely worth a few extra hours of drawing just to be able to work out all of those problems in a piece with this separate sketch before I start in on the final. And honestly, it never hurts to have this sort of built-in test run when I'm working on a piece. If there's any issues with the drawing as far as anatomy or composition, I really want to get those figured out early. It's just so much easier to make changes to a piece before you've got that final sheet of paper in front of you. At this next stage, I'm going to be switching over to inks, and since I'm trying to give the character in this piece a sort of a glowing effect, I really want to preserve the white of the paper rather than having to go back in white charcoal or white ink to get that lighter value. So this first step you're going to see I'm applying masking fluid to all of the areas that I want to keep white. And that'll let me be a little bit less careful with my ink washes, knowing that I don't have to watch out for keeping those details clean while I'm working. Even though I've got these very lightest areas protected with the masking fluid, I'm also using paper towels to blot up some of the ink. Pretty much anywhere that's going to be on the lighter end of the value scale, I'm being really cautious with how much ink is actually going down. This isn't going to give me a pure white in those areas, the way that the masking fluid will, but it will help me keep everything a little bit lighter. I like to keep my layers of ink really thin like this at this stage, because you can always add more layers to make things darker, but once a wash is down, there's not a lot you can do to lighten it up. So I always go really slow at this stage. It makes it a little bit tedious to do, and probably also a little bit tedious to watch, but it does seem to work pretty well. One thing you do want to be a little bit careful with is if you're applying the masking fluid over areas with a lot of pencil work, there's a pretty good chance you're going to lose some of those lines when you go to peel it up. For me, that isn't too much of a problem here since I don't have a ton of line art in those light areas anyways, but it's still something to watch out for. One thing you might notice while I'm working on the inks is that I'm keeping this little homemade value chart handy. I've actually got a digital value study that I worked up early on in the process where I kind of figured out where I wanted all the darks and lights to go throughout the piece. And I've got that same value chart alongside my digital study just to serve as a reference point for how dark I want various areas of the piece to go. So whenever you're seeing me holding that chart up to the painting, I'm double checking it against the digital version just to make sure I'm getting close to the right value for each area. It's really easy to sort of lose your ability to judge values objectively once you've been staring at a piece for too long, so I use this as kind of a good trick to stay on track with what I'm aiming for with the value structure. pretty much going for a monochromatic look here, but I do feel like a piece needs a little bit of, if not color variation, at least a little bit of temperature variation. So I usually bring in a few watercolor washes once I'm mostly finished with the inks. In this case, I'm basically just adding a kind of a greenish bronze tone to the metal and to some of the fabric, and a little further in you'll see me adding some warm tones to the skin as well. Watercolor tends to look fairly bright when it first goes down, but especially since I'm working over these kind of darker gray ink washes, as soon as it dries it really loses a lot of its vibrancy. So anywhere that I want a stronger color, I find myself having to go back over those areas 2 or 3 times just to build up the amount of color that I'm going for. So at this point, I've probably got at least a dozen or so layers of ink and watercolor on top of my underdrawing. And it's starting to lose a lot of its detail and definition, starting to get a little bit blurry and just generally not looking amazing. So from here, I'm going back in with that 9H pencil again, mostly just touching up the original drawing, but I'll also be adding in some extra details wherever they fit in. Eventually, you'll see that the scarves and the hair are getting some texture that they didn't have originally. And this sort of stuff isn't really necessary to the image, but at this point in the process, I kind of need it to stay interested, and I do think it adds something to the end result. At this stage, I've basically taken care of all the darker values, and just to set those off, I'm going to do a pass of highlights. You can see that I'm starting off with white charcoal, and normally this is a bit more dramatic of an effect, but since I've kept my overall value structure fairly light on this piece, that step up in values isn't quite so pronounced this time, especially on camera because it does kind of blow out those lighter values quite a bit. But even still, it adds a lot of finish to the piece, and my process has quite a few steps like this that don't make a huge difference on their own, but when they're combined with a bunch of other small changes, they really pull everything together and give the piece some depth and complexity that it wouldn't have otherwise. So I realized in here that I didn't have quite enough contrast to sell that glowing effect for the face. So I'm actually going in with some black and dark brown colored pencils really lightly, just to push the surrounding areas a little bit darker and pump up that contrast a bit. That's one of the big advantages of this process actually, is that all these different media really play together well. So to some degree at least, you can switch back and forth between them as much as you need to get the right effect. Here I'm switching back to colored pencil again. The graphite lines are just slightly not dark enough to stand out in those darker areas of ink. So wherever I have 2 dark shapes butting up against each other and I still want the outlines, I'm touching up the line art a little with a dark gray pencil, just so it doesn't get completely lost in the shadows. I'm doing a few final touches with ink here, both to darken up the values in 1 or 2 places and also to smooth out some of that uneven texture that colored pencil can leave. From here, you're going to see me putting in just a few final details, little touch-ups in colored pencil and white charcoal wherever the piece needs it, a little bit of additional watercolor work. The only stage that I'm not showing you, just because it's kind of tough to film, is that after everything else is just the way I want it, I'll be adding some really fine splatters with a toothbrush dipped in ink. And I really like this for adding texture to the piece, and it's also great for camouflaging these stray marks or places the washes might not have gone quite as intended. It's another pretty minor detail that just works really nicely to finish out the piece.